brother was always making things from the strangest materials. I mean, things that other people thought of as rubbish to be disposed of. He once made a long two-edged knife from the tip of a Roman sword. He spent hours carving a handle for it from a thigh bone of a sheep, and then he sold it to a zealot. We thought about that knife now and then. It made us laugh to think of a Roman sword being used to be slit between the ribs of a Roman soldier in a crowded marketplace. It was being in an occupied country that made us so callous. It was certainly being poor that made you turn a blind eye to anything but profit. Anyway, one day Ahaz came back from the temple with a ragged piece of calf skin. The bulk of the whole hide would have been used for a scroll for the calligraphers in the temple. But this ragged edge bit was too blemished for the scriptures. It would have been thrown away or burnt. So he brought it from the tannery and he fashioned it into a whip. He made a good whip, did Ahaz. You would have thought it was fairly easy, wouldn't you? Well, it isn't. You have to balance a whip to make sure it does its job. And of course each job demands a different kind of whip. The sort of whip a cattle herd or a goat herd would use is more like a thick, springy stick than a whip. It has to be made of a hard, coarse leather, and that needs to be bound and plaited tight. You couldn't use that on a slave. You might as well just hit him with the branch of a tree. The whip you see coiled in a charioteer's hand has to be made of one long, thin strip. It has to be long so that it can reach across the horses in the train. It has to be thin so that it can give the horse a good sting like a horsefly. And of course it has to be supple so it has the momentum to spring back into the charioteer's hand, and then Sorry, am I boring you? Anyway, the leather Ahaz had that day it wasn't thick enough for a goat herd, and it was too thick for a charioteer. And besides, it wasn't long enough. It was only really any good for short strips. And so Ahaz made what the Romans called a flagellum. Now, if anything other than a human being could be said to radiate evil, then it would be said of a flagellum. It was a short, stumpy whip with several ugly, short straps radiating out from a thick, braided handle. And it only had one purpose: to cause as much pain and misery as possible with the smallest amount of effort. An experienced hand with the flagellum could make it look like he was laying a robe on a prisoner's body, rather than what he was really doing, which of course was flaying the poor bloke alive, making his whole body feel as though it was on fire. How he achieved that was simple, like the best or the worst ideas. Ahaz studded the end of each strip with a piece of lead, so that the sharp leather buried itself into the skin like a fish hook, and then drag off strips of skin as the whip was pulled away. A sort of double pain, really. He made it to a pattern that a Roman centurion had given him. Each strap was a regulation length, and each stud was a regulation weight. And it was Ahaz's flagellum that they used on Jesus. I saw it. I was in the courtyard of the Antonio when they brought him in, sitting in the shade beneath the wall, waiting for Ahaz to conclude a little unofficial business with the garrison cook. Some of the priests in the temple would faint with shock if they knew who a lot of the Passover sacrifices were feeding. I know it was Ahaz's whip because I recognised the bloke using it. A big beefy Syrian that we used to do a bit of business with. Besides, the knot on the end of the handle was distinctive. Only Ahaz made knots like that. I just wish it wasn't on Jesus that Syrian had used it. I wish I hadn't seen it. I wish Ahaz hadn't made the whip. It felt like a real betrayal. Jesus was the only good thing in our lives, Ahaz's and mine. We'd spent our lives ducking and diving, making a shekel here and there, and trying to keep out of harm's way. Just trying to earn a living, that's all. We'd hang around the market, on the fringes, unremarkable. If anybody did notice us, they were more likely to curse us than to bless, unless they wanted a bit of dodgy work doing. We weren't above begging at the worst of times, and the only one who ever noticed us for who we were rather than what we were was Jesus. He would look out for us in Jerusalem when he came. He would notice us on the fringes of his meetings. He would ask our opinion. He would share stories, and he wasn't above pinching a few of ours if he felt they made the point he wanted to get over. Because he would laugh with us, not at us. He made us feel for the first time in our streetwise lives that we were important, that what we felt and how we behaved really matters. He had this trick of somehow knowing what we were thinking and putting it into words. I remember watching this merchant come into the city with a train of camels while Jesus was talking about the riches of God's gifts to us all. This merchant was covered in fine clothes. Every one of his fingers dripped with gold, and his hair and his beard gleamed. His camels were literally groaning under the weight of these huge panniers on either side of their bodies. And I remember looking at this merchant and wishing it were my fingers that dripped with gold, and that it was my beard that smelt so sweet. I was just calculating what I would have to do to become as rich as him when Jesus spoke. Ahab, he called to me, "You see that rich merchant? How fat he is with wealth, how bloated he is with riches." "Of course I did," I said. "Well," he said, turning and pointing to the gate in the wall in Jerusalem, so narrow that they called it the Needle's Eye. "Those fat groaning camels with their fat groaning packs will get through the eye of a needle easier than the rich will get through the gate of heaven." And he had everyone laughing, Ahaz and myself included, if only because it was clear from his red face and his spluttering that the merchant had heard Jesus as clearly as I had. I must have seen hundreds of merchants go through the city gates over the years, but it had never occurred to me to look for signs of God's kingdom in such an ordinary event. But that was Jesus for you, an ordinary seeming bloke until you listened to him, who took the ordinary things of life and made them extraordinary, until the ordinary, mundane and mediocre people who refused to listen to him took the ordinary tools of life and put him to death. I wish Ahaz hadn't made that whip. I really do.